The name's film. Remember the film. And we have a license to podcast. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the podcast where this week, as you might have guessed, we're going to have a discussion about James Bond. We're going to talk a bit about the James Bond series in general, and then we'll get into our film to remember this week, which we said was going to be License to Kill, but then we decided because of how it sort of has some thematic ties to No Time to Die, it just came out this week, we decided to do On Her Majesty's Secret Service instead. Before we get into that, I'm Hugo, and joining me this week is my usual co-host, Jeff Grizz.
Hello!
And Josh isn't with us this week because he was busy, and so we have friend of the show and returning guest, Matt Curran. How you doing, Matt?
Hello, pleasure to be here.
Sure.
Sure.
Sure. Yeah. Was that Sean Connery?
It was trying to be.
It was Connery-esque.
I mean, I got it, so like it was recognizable, so
yeah.
we got it. Yeah. So yeah, this week, No Time to Die came out, so we decided to do a Bond episode. Seemed like a good occasion for that. So before we get into our film to remember, we'll talk a bit about James Bond and the 007 series in general. So we're just going to go into, for each of us, when did we find out about James Bond? What's our history with the series? How many have we seen? What's our relationship to it? Are we fans? Are we not fans? That kind of stuff. So, Matt, do you want to start?
Sure. So my history and relationship with Bond. So it's funny. I told Jeff, last time when I was on the podcast, we were talking about Lawrence of Arabia, and I did a lot of preparation in anticipation of that episode. And whenever I, was getting ready for this episode, I told Jeff yesterday, I feel like I've been preparing for this episode my entire life. I've been a Bond fan basically since I was like 7 or 8 years old, which happened to be right around the time that Nintendo 64 came out, which of course meant that's when GoldenEye, the video game, came out. Of course. And, that was really my biggest entry into James Bond. I got to be such a big fan so quickly. My mom actually bought me a CD of all of the James Bond theme songs on it, and it was like at that time it was the 25th anniversary, so it was made in 87 or 88. And so I listened to that. I mean, I wore that CD out into the ground basically. If it were a record, it would have had scratches all the heck over that thing, right? And then it's funny, I was thinking about this yesterday too. Jeff will remember this, at least in the States. We had in the States a lot of times in the past, I think when video stores and video rental stores were such a huge thing. I mean, look at Schitt's Creek, right? That's their whole thing, is that Johnny Rose, was the owner of a video store chain. But the reason I bring this up is because they even had like video rental operations within grocery stores in the U.S. Yeah. And so I used to go into the video rental area of our grocery store whenever my mom would take me grocery shopping. And like every single time I was looking for a new James Bond movie. So I had seen the vast majority of the Bond movies by like the age of 11.
Right.
It was crazy. Anyway, that's my history and relationship with it.
I, as of this week, have seen every Bond movie except for the Casino Royale, the farcical, nonsensical, garbage Casino Royale. So that's the only one I haven't seen. But I was not a diehard fan from childhood like Matt. Although I would say my interest in Bond started at the same time when GoldenEye 64 came out. Because obviously Matt and I are childhood friends, and we played those games. But I was watching a few of the Pierce Brosnan ones as they were coming out, and then it wasn't until like last year that I decided to go back and I should watch all of the Connery ones and all the I started working my way through them. I had seen a lot of them on TV before, but it was always like I jump in halfway through and don't really know the plot, and then it turns out on a lot of these rewatches, it's like, oh, I was never going to know the plot. Because some of the plots are so convoluted that there's no way you're going to know, even if you've seen it before. But yeah, I enjoy the Bond franchise. When I was watching these movies this week, I think I told Matt last night that I think I like the franchise. I don't love the franchise. And so I'm not going to pretend to be a maniac about it, but I do have strong opinions.
Right.
Yeah, and I'll have something else to say about that in a second too.
So yeah, for me, I think I've seen more Bond movies than I remember. Because I definitely remember seeing the 16. There's 16 movies that I definitely remember seeing, because some of them I saw them this week, and some of them I just had seen a bunch when I was a kid. And I think the Brosnan movies were the ones that I saw first. But then, like, now this week I watched a bunch of, like, I watched a few, I think I watched 3 of the Sean Connery ones, I watched one of the Roger Moore ones, and even the Living Daylights. And watching them, I always realized, oh yeah, no, I've seen this before. So I've definitely seen a bunch of them as a very young kid on TV, but because it's been so long, I didn't really remember them completely. But yeah, as a kid, I think I enjoyed the Brosnan movies, like even the ones that now I recognize are pretty terrible. Like, I remember Die Another Day was like, oh, this movie's fun. He's surfing on fucking waves and stuff. Like, that's likely that happens. But yeah, that's possible. But yeah, and then I think where I really became a fan of the idea of Bond, at least, was with when Casino Royale released. I was 10 years old. Maybe that movie wasn't completely appropriate for a 10-year-old, but my dad took me to see it at the cinema anyway, because he took me to see every movie. And so, like, from then on, I feel like I've been a fan, and maybe I feel like I think I consider myself a fan. Even if the movies, like, when I judge the individual movies, I find a lot of flaws with a lot of them, but the promise and the idea of the Bond movies is never not interesting to me. Like, I would still watch any of them in a heartbeat, because, like, there's something about it that is just a fun concept. Like, I think it got me into spy movies as a kid, and then it's still, even if there are other spy franchises that maybe overall are more consistently good, like Mission Impossible or even the Bond trilogy, the Jason Bourne trilogy, there's something about Bond that still has a special vibe to it that the other ones don't have. Yeah, and maybe it's just because it came before. Maybe it's just like there's so many iconic things about the Bond movies that maybe even Mission Impossible doesn't really have, and so they sort of stick with you in that sense, in the same way. Yeah, so expanding on that, what are some things that we like and dislike maybe about the series? Like, so for me, as I said, what I do really like is how they've managed to create iconic things that even if you're tangentially interested in movies, you recognize the elements that are very much James Bond 007 things, and I think the best movies in the series use that formula to either comment on it or just perfect that formula to an extent that they are really, really, really good movies. What in terms of dislikes, again, I think a lot of the old movies are, I think, extremely iconic, but when you go back to them with sort of a 2021 eye, they can feel a bit episodic, like where there's a main plot, but then midway through a bunch of different things happen, and then goons show up because, oh, at this point we need an action scene, and they kind of feel a bit episodic in that way. But so I think overall as movies,
like episodic within each movie, you mean? Yeah,
within each movie they feel quite episodic to me. But having said that, I still like find enjoyment in all of them. Like even the ones that I'm like, oh, this movie is like maybe a 6 out of 10, maybe not even, but I still really enjoy watching it because like the good parts are so like iconic and good that I find them really enjoyable.
It's funny because there's so there's definitely a Bond formula, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
Like if you're making a Bond movie, you have to basically follow this recipe, right? Like that's how I feel like a lot of times, and especially for a lot of years, they've followed a very specific formula. Yeah. Almost like they put the whole series on autopilot to a certain extent, right?
For decades,
and I think a lot of pretty much, yeah. and I think the best Bond movies, typically, at least in my opinion, are the ones that do a really good job of like breaking from that formula and doing something totally different, right? Like,
yeah. But like,
we'll talk about it.
not necessarily they deviate from the formula, but they are self-aware about the formula and they do something fun with it. I think those are the ones that are my favorite, at least.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, as far as like likes and dislikes, I like the gadgets. That's one of my favorite like things that you see in Bond movies are cool gadgets. And I put a little caveat on that. I like the gadgets when they're actually useful. When they, sometimes the gadgets are nonsensical, and it's like this is just like especially in the campier movies, they have some really silly gadgets, and I'm like, okay, well that I don't need that. But like when the gadgets are like cool and do something, then like oh yeah, that's really awesome. I get really into those gadgets, especially all the vehicles. Love the vehicles in the Bond movies.
Yeah.
I don't know about you guys. One of my favorite vehicles from the whole Bond series is the car from The Spy Who Loved Me that turns into a submarine.
Yes. Yeah, that was awesome.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
But dislikes for me, it's the main dislike, and this is like a super obvious one that like especially like Hugo said, watching it with a 2021 viewpoint. There's a lot of misogyny. In the earlier Bond movies, and like because obviously we're cognizant of when the movies came out. I'm able to watch these movies and still say, okay, aside from that, what do I like about this movie? Because it's like I really don't like that aspect of the Bond movies.
Yeah.
And it's not to say that like the romance and even like Bond sleeping around, like that's not the thing I dislike. It's when it's like in the Connery movies where he'll like straight up beat women and and no, thank you.
Maybe like there's that scene. I think there's that scene. Is it in? I can't remember if it's Goldfinger or if it's From Russia with Love, where he's at. It's Goldfinger. It's definitely Goldfinger, where he's talking to some guy who's giving him a mission, and then the girl he was with shows up, and she was like, "Oh, honey, just go away. It's man talk." And she leaves, and he
like smacks her on the ass. Yeah.
No, thank you.
Like, oh, okay, we're doing this now. In that sense, they feel pretty dated.
They're really dated.
And,
and like I said, the romance stuff, like him seducing women as part of his missions, all that stuff. That's part of the Bond.
Yeah,
that's part of the Bond experience. And it's just like, I draw a line, there. It's like, okay, well, let's not be mean.
Bond was like you. It's like you always have to keep in mind the context that it was originally created in, right? Like, it was created by someone who had been in the British Secret Service, in the Naval Intelligence Service, Ian Fleming, and it was a film and novels, obviously, created by men for men, right? Like, and specifically created by men from that age for men from that age. Like, that was the original nexus of Bond, right? So, like, all of the problematic portrayals around, especially misogyny, that's like the biggest thing, I think, of course, but some of the other movies really play on like racial stereotypes too, to a certain degree.
Live and Let Die, looking at you, bud.
Yeah, exactly. But even small little stereotypes in other films too, right? But
for sure.
I guess all I'm saying with that is like it's definitely a fantasy portrayal that was the fantasy of men in the 50s and 60s of how they thought, the ideal man from the 50s and 60s should be. You got to remember, this is the age of like the height of Playboy as well, right?
Yeah.
Like Playboy literally never got bigger than like the 60s and 70s. And I mean, that's when Bond was big. It all kind of was melded together.
And I feel like to me, that context is something that I appreciate a lot, especially with the Connery films and the films of the 60s. I feel like I get where those elements that are dated are coming from. I feel like the series took a little too long after that to get over that stuff. Like I feel like in the Roger Moore era, we're post counterculture, we're post the revolutions of 1969, the cultural revolutions of 1969. Like there's stuff has happened. Like the world had moved on at least to some extent, because like when you go back and see a lot of 80s movies and 70s movies, they still have some really dated elements. But I don't know, I feel like the Roger Moore era, I don't know if we'll talk about who our favorite Bond is, but like for me, the Roger Moore era, the stuff that I've seen is the one that feels the most out of place in some ways, because like I can still, even though there's those things that I don't like with today's eyes in the Sean Connery movies, I understand the time they were made in. But then when I see a movie made in like 1975, 77 or whatever, and it just feels a little off.
Yeah.
I
feel like the whole Bond franchise, until recently, like Daniel Craig's era, I think it has always been 5 to 10 years behind the rest of culture. And maybe that's like in terms of like, those particular issues.
Okay, maybe. I get.
I wouldn't say that for the early movies. I mean,
sorry, yeah. Obviously, with Connery, that was the culture at the time. But like you're saying with Roger Moore, it's like we there had been a cultural revolution, and maybe it had. Maybe I'm picturing it having taken roots in the rest of the world much more than it actually did, and maybe this is maybe Roger Moore was still very much the way things were in that time period. But it does feel like they're dragging a little bit. And you can see the progress in the franchise, where the women characters start to be written better, and they're given more important roles, and it's less about them as objects and more about them as characters. And
there's also I feel like there's also sort of a back and forth as well, because like the Dalton movies, for example, are not as misogynistic and as the Moore movies were. Then with I mean, I really like GoldenEye. I feel like GoldenEye is kind of its own thing compared to the other Brosnan movies. But then the other Brosnan movies feel like they are reverting back to formula a little bit more. Yeah. And I think there's...
it feels like...
There's a lot of producer control. And I feel like the producers are always, this was successful, so we'll just do that again. And then they try something different. This wasn't quite as successful. I guess we'll go back to the original formula. And I think it's more driven by that than necessarily like a creative choice to make those movies misogynistic. You know what I mean?
It does always feel like they're kind of reacting to whatever the criticism was of the most recent movie, right? Yes. Like they're always like, well, we went too serious on that one, so we got to go more lighthearted the next movie. And then it's like, oh, we went way too far in that direction. Now we got to go back to our roots and be really serious again, right? Like And I agree with the yo-yo analogy.
Even with and regardless of just the cultural element of that, but even with the movies as in terms of what they do with their action, the style that they choose, it does feel like the franchise was like a trailblazer in the 60s, where it basically pioneered a genre that became extremely popular in the 60s and then later on in the history of cinema.
And we'll talk about this more with this movie in particular, like later on, but as an example, that in On Her Majesty's Secret Service, there's a lot of the sequences where Bond is fist fighting, and as they're jumping from shot to shot within this fight, I'm like, oh, this is very similar to the Bourne movies.
This actually looks more modern than I would have thought.
Yeah, exactly, and it's because movies like this one and other Bond movies set up these action movie techniques that we see all the time.
But then after that, it became a little more reactionary to what the rest of cinema was doing. Like, even Casino Royale, to some extent, which, spoilers, is my favorite Bond movie. Like, to some extent, it does feel like they saw, the Bourne trilogy and even maybe Batman Begins, or at least what Batman Begins was supposed to be, and they got this idea of how this movie should be. And I feel like with Craig, they managed to create their own identity, but, like, in many ways, oftentimes they're kind of reacting to what's happening around them in movies, and that, I don't know, I feel like that's both good and bad about the series. Like, it's kind of cool to just watch different eras of this series, because you kind of get an idea of what's happening in cinema at that time, and it's kind of like, as a cultural experiment, I think it's really interesting.
And it is cool within the Bond franchise that sometimes they are the pioneer in something, and then sometimes, like you're saying, they're learning from the other things, which is probably a key to the series' longevity, that they are taking lessons from other action movies that took lessons from Bond movies, and that's how they keep
and there's a back and forth
becoming refreshed.
Agreed. So we talk about so No Time to Die just came out. Matt, you didn't get to see it, I think.
I did not get to see it yet. Yeah, the funny story about that is that apparently in LA, everybody went to the theaters all of a sudden because literally every ticket within a 30-mile radius was sold out, in my area for the next 4 days.
Hey,
so have not seen it.
Good for the theaters. I hope they get good business. I hope people are being safe, hopefully, in the theaters, but still.
Yep.
We'll see how it goes.
I had no trouble finding tickets. I could have seen the movie 6 times this weekend.
Well, there you go.
But
But I saw it. Yeah,
so I did.
it
I did
came
see it.
out actually, I guess 10 days ago in Italy. But I watched it on Tuesday because I wanted to wait where I could find a screening that was in English because I didn't want to see this dubbed because, you know, it's a very British movie and I want to see the British
You want to see it be British.
Yeah, I want to see it be British. I think that's an essential element of the Bond franchise. If there's one thing that the Bond franchise should be, is British. That's for sure.
Despite the fact that most of the Bonds, well, I guess they were all, or a lot of them were British,
I mean,
not necessarily English, though.
They're British, yeah. Not English, maybe, but they're definitely British. Or at least acting very extremely British. So we saw it just briefly. I thought it was awesome. I encourage everyone who likes these movies to go see it. I thought, I don't know, it wasn't my favorite Craig movie, but there's 2 Craig movies that are my favorite Bond movies. So I sort of like, it didn't quite reach those heights for me, but I think it's still among the better entries in the series for sure. I really had a great time.
I really loved it. I think this will be the lesson for all future Bond series on how to close out someone's time as Bond. Because
that's for sure.
I really, really loved it, and it made me both sad to see Daniel Craig's time end, but also very hopeful for the future of the Bond franchise because they told an emotionally resonant story in a Bond movie, and you don't always get that with Bond.
You know, I think an interesting footnote to what you just said, Jeff, is I believe this is the first time that they made this movie knowing that for sure this was the actor's last turn or go in this role, right? Like knowing there is no more of this actor in this role after this. Like I'm pretty sure that's the first time this has actually happened.
Funnily enough, on Her Majesty's Secret Service, which is our film to remember, might be kind of an exception to that. Because like even during filming, it seemed pretty clear that Lazenby wasn't going to come back, and that even the director who worked on Bond movies before wasn't going to come back. So they sort of
it wasn't a stated thing though.
But it wasn't a stated thing before. It wasn't the objective behind the movie, and it also wasn't the conclusion to a run. It was just like, oh, they just happened to make one movie with one actor, and they knew there wasn't going to be more. So it's not exactly the same.
Sorry, Hugo. I was going to say the producers were definitely trying to not have that be the case with Lazenby. Well, for a while at least. But anyway, it's a good point.
But I highly recommend No Time to Die. In fact, as soon as I got out of the movie, I texted Matt, and I don't remember exactly what I said, but it was something like, stop whatever you're doing and go watch No Time to Die.
right now. Go see it right now.
Go see it right now. Now, if you're watching this podcast, please continue to watch the podcast and then go see No Time to Die.
Definitely.
Obviously.
Definitely. So, with that in mind, so we really enjoyed No Time to Die. I think it might be clear what the answer to these questions are for us, but what is our favorite? I'm just going to go around and say who's our favorite Bond, if we have a favorite Bond title song, and what our top 5 007 films are. So, whoever wants to begin.
Let's kick it off with the guest.
Yes.
Who my favorite Bond is? Such a hard question to answer because I like a lot of them for a lot of different reasons. If you were to put a gun to my head and kind of make me choose, like force me to choose, I would have a really hard. I'd probably just die, but I would probably have a hard time choosing between Timothy Dalton and Daniel Craig. I like the seriousness that both of them bring to the portrayal. Right, I think with both of them, you definitely get the feeling that these guys are killers, man. Like, do not get on their bad side. They will hunt you down and you will die. Right? Like, so, I mean, I think I like both of that. I also am tempted to kind of say Connery because even though we talked already about a lot of the problematic parts of his portrayal, I mean, he originated the character, but not only that, it's the cool factor that he brings to it, right? He's such a charismatic presence in pretty much every facet of his portrayal that it's hard not to really enjoy him specifically as Bond. If not, if you don't enjoy the whole movie, you probably will enjoy Connery's portrayal.
Yeah, I feel like even if the Connery movies might not be your favorite, like I still think that despite other movies being better, in my opinion, he's still the most iconic as Bond. Like, when you think of James Bond, the first image that comes to mind is still Sean Connery, even all these years after that.
And I will say, Lazenby is approaching the charisma levels of Sean Connery, and so I like, despite him only being in the one movie, like as far as who they picked to come in after Sean Connery, I was like, oh, that's actually a pretty solid pick. He has good screen presence, and he, he's a good-looking man, and well built and everything. So like, he's got a lot of the same things that made Connery perfect for the role. And then after Lazenby's done, they bring back Connery for one more, and then we get Roger Moore, who is very different in basically every kind of facet. And a lot of people love Roger Moore, and that's great. But for me, I'm with Matt. My favorites are Daniel Craig and Timothy Dalton. And I really, I just don't know how Timothy Dalton didn't do more. It just baffles me, because I really love both of those movies. But I do think I still pick Daniel Craig overall. And I think it's because his story arc is self-contained.
For me, it's Daniel Craig. Just like, I grew up with it. Like, it's very difficult for me. Like, for me, it was the first time that I really got into James Bond as a series, and not just like individual movies that maybe were cool. Like, growing up to some extent, I did feel initially that Brosnan was almost like, at least in GoldenEye, and even to some extent I still feel that way. I feel like in GoldenEye, Brosnan is the perfect encapsulation of all that Bond has been in all the movies before it. Like, he's cool like Sean Connery, but he's also capable of being like sillier like Roger Moore, and there are moments where he's more serious like Dalton. And that whole movie, I feel like, is the ultimate classic Bond movie, where it kind of brings all the different elements of Bond into one thing, and then after that they were never able to really do that again, and they had to do different things with the franchise. But yeah, Craig overall is still my favorite. It's the first time that I really cared about, with the exception of On Her Majesty's Secret Service again, but that where I really cared about the character as a character, and I wasn't just, this is a larger than life figure who's just doing these awesome spy things. And with No Time to Die, especially, like, his emotional arc throughout the 5 movies is really impressive. Even though 2 of them are a little weaker overall.
Brosnan is definitely the most polished Bond out of all of them, right? Like, to your point, they've rounded all the corners of James Bond with Pierce Brosnan's portrayal, for sure.
And I feel like that's the reason why, both in terms of the actor and his portrayal and what the movies are doing with Craig, they did something so completely different. Because, like, after Brosnan, I feel like there was nothing left to say for that same character, and you had to do something different with it.
Yeah.
In terms of Bond songs, do we have any strong opinions on this? Because, like, for me, like, it's pretty much, it's Skyfall. Shout out to Live and Let Die, just because it's Paul McCartney, and
so I was gonna say, Live and Let Die is going to be my favorite Bond song overall, but that movie is so bad. I prefer the
Guns N' Roses version, so...
Okay. All right.
That's a take.
I want to hear that.
But I mean, when I watched Live and Let Die earlier this week, I was like, I'm going to like this movie because I love that Bond song so much. I just know I'm going to like it. And I didn't like the movie. But it did get an extra bonus half a star from me because of that song. Because the song is so good. But then my second favorite, I was thinking about this, and I gotta say, I think my second favorite Bond song is actually "You Know My Name," the Chris Cornell song from Casino Royale. I like Chris Cornell, so it's easy to pick that.
Fair enough.
Plus that opening title sequence from Casino Royale was
cool.
I realized this recently. Like, it's so different from every other title sequence that, especially the few that came right before it, those were very like CGI heavy in the sense of like just computer animated, like women drenched in oil for The World Is Not Enough, right? Stuff like that. And then they went into that one for Casino Royale where it's all cards and it's very animated and like it's so cool.
And it still had sort of a 1950s 1960s aesthetic to that opening sequence.
For sure.
And I mean, so that song fits really well there as well. And then, of course, I'm not going to, no doubt, Skyfall really freaking good.
For me, like, there's something about how Skyfall fits the vibe and the theme of that movie so perfectly that it somehow elevates it. Aside from the fact that it's the most basic pick you can have, it was a gigantic hit at the time, but like, it's just a really good song and it really fits the movie, so it just kind of... But I will say, Billie Eilish's No Time to Die, I think, will be an underrated pick. I think in a few years we'll remember it, because the movie... Again, that song really fits the movie well, I think, and I really like that song.
The only other pick that I would say for a Bond song out of the ones that you guys have already said, because you named some of my favorites already, would be Nobody Does It Better, which was the theme from The Spy Who Loved Me. It's by Carly Simon. Very, very good. It was actually composed by Marvin Hamlish, which he was a pretty big film composer, and he was kind of it was one of the rare times in those days when they did not have John Barry doing the music for the film. So don't get me wrong. I will take John Barry doing a James Bond movie as the score any day over Marvin Hamlish, but I do like that one song.
I will say Nobody Does It Better tied with Live and Let Die for second on the highest it peaked on the U.S. charts. Live and Let Die and Nobody Does It Better both peaked at number 2. The only one that peaked higher was A View to a Kill. Duran Duran peaked at number 1 on the U.S. charts.
Wow.
I mean, yeah, Duran Duran were pretty big in the 80s.
Yeah.
Well, Jeff and I were talking about this recently. It's like the Bond movies always do a really good job of capturing artists who are like literally at the very cusp of their, or like the very height of their popularity at that time, right? Like we were saying, like, yeah, in 2015 they did Sam Smith. I haven't heard anybody talk about Sam Smith in 3 or 4 years at least. But at that time, everybody was talking about him, right? Like, yeah. So anyway.
And so now we see that Billie Eilish is going to be on the downhill slide. Sorry, Billie.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Sorry, Billy. In 2 or 3 years, we're not going to be talking about you anymore.
Although that didn't happen with Adele. Adele,
Like,
You're right.
I'm pretty confident Billie Eilish
She's
at
gonna be fine.
21 or whatever she is. She's pretty set for life at this point.
Yeah.
So I think
Oh,
she'll
she
be
doesn't.
okay.
She definitely does not have to work another day in her life. That's for sure.
Yeah. So okay, top 5 Bond movies very quickly. For me, I'll start. I have at 5. I have On Her Majesty's Secret Service, which is the film to remember this week. At 4, I have GoldenEye for the reasons that I said before. Also a childhood favorite. At 3, I have No Time to Die. At 2, Skyfall, and at 1, Casino Royale. Casino Royale is still my favorite, despite the fact that in some ways Skyfall is a more well-structured film, and it's definitely a prettier film because I mean the cinematography was absolutely amazing on that one. There's something about Casino Royale that still gets me. The way it humanizes the character in to some extent, Skyfall is a consequence of that, but the achievement of what they did with the character in Casino Royale is still hasn't been beaten for me. So what about you guys?
I'll go. In my 5 spot, I have Skyfall. Number 4, The Living Daylights. Number 3, License to Kill, which, this is indicating just how much I like Timothy Dalton's tenure as Bond. Number 2, Casino Royale, and then number 1, No Time to Die, which like I said, I absolutely love. So, not a surprise there. Really, can't stress enough how much you should go see No Time to Die. Matt.
Every person in LA. For me, it seems like we are very Craig heavy in this list, which I guess I will be too. That's okay. Number 5 for me is Dr. No. Number 4 for me is Skyfall. Number 3 is our movie of the week, On Her Majesty's Secret Service. Number 2 is From Russia with Love. And number 1 is Casino Royale. Subject to change since I haven't seen No Time to Die, I suppose, but that's where it stands right now.
From Russia with Love, I will say, is also my favorite Connery. Like, I think a lot of people say Goldfinger, and I feel like From Russia with Love is a much more focused movie.
Yeah,
Goldfinger is my favorite Connery.
Right. Okay.
But then my second favorite Connery is From Russia with Love.
Yeah.
I would
Love,
say
like that final fight in From Russia with Love and the tension
Awesome.
on that train. Oh, it's really excellent. Like it holds
That
up
you-
completely.
you just said the key word, the tension in that
Yeah.
right before that fight, right? Where
Yeah.
you've seen Robert Shaw's character throughout the whole movie. You know he's the bad guy. You know Bond also knows he's the bad guy, and the bad guy knows that Bond is Bond. So you're like, oh my god, just start fighting already.
Yeah, it's great.
Yeah.
So also that's final thing, and then we'll get into the movie. What do you guys think they'll do for the future of the series? Because like I feel like Craig is a really tough act to follow, and I don't know, like, do they go back to sort of a zanier, sillier tone, or do they try to reinvent it completely? Like, I really don't know how you follow Craig, and I know I'm saying this with the context of No Time to Die, which Matt hasn't seen and we won't spoil, but still, like, the fact that they give a complete arc to the character like this, and which hasn't been done before, I really don't know where they go from here, because, like, I feel like you can't go back anymore. Like, that 60s 70s Bond just doesn't, I don't know if it has a place in 2020s cinema.
I will say that the most Bond-esque non-Bond movie that has come out in like the last 10 years or so, in my opinion, is Atomic Blonde.
Right.
I don't know if you guys saw that from a few years back, but like the action sequences specifically in that movie, when I came out of the theater from that, I was like, that was awesome. Like, and I think the reason is because it's so realistic. They get so tired in that movie, right? As they're fighting each other, like they just get exhausted by the end of the fight to the point where they can barely throw a punch.
Yeah.
But anyway, the whole point of me bringing this up is because I feel like the Bond movies are always trying to take influences from other things, right? Like you just said earlier about Casino Royale, all of the influences you can see from the Bourne trilogy. I mean, I think I'm just trying to sit here and think about, okay, what are the other things that are happening in this same general type of movie that they will try to draw influence from? I mean, I think just in a general sense, as far as where they take the character itself, I don't know. There's been a lot of writing, online, rumors online and everything about, it kind of seems like the producers may want to even think about having a woman play James Bond. I don't know, maybe it's Jamie Bond, or maybe they just have a totally different name altogether. I don't know. But I think they definitely are kind of at a point where they go, we want to potentially try doing something totally different. Who knows? We'll see.
And I hope they do. And I really hope they do.
That's what I think is the solution here. I think by seeing Daniel Craig's arc all the way through, and they've seen that people responded well to having a complete life of Bond with one Bond actor, I think that shows that audiences can get used to the idea of a complete reboot. And if we've seen anything from, comic book movies, you can do a reboot every decade with the same character, and people will go see it. So
sometimes, if you're Spider-Man, you can do it 3 times in a decade.
Precisely. So I think that's the next step, is to go ahead and do another reboot, do another completely new take. I think having a woman Bond or woman 007, if they don't want to carry on the name Bond, then cool. That would be an interesting way to take it. I also, as far as like actors and things, like we've been saying it for years. I would love to see Idris Elba as Bond. He
I
might
feel like
definitely.
I think he's probably getting a little too old now for that.
I mean, I will say they could do a big one-off with Idris Elba, because they know people have been wanting to see him as Bond for such a long time, and I feel like that could work, but I don't know if they are willing to commit.
I mean,
just
talk about an
one
actor with
movie.
charisma.
Yeah. I mean,
he's got that Bond charisma.
Yeah, that man is the coolest guy you'll ever see. So
another thought I had was maybe like someone like John Boyega, who again,
I've
British.
Seen speculation with that, yeah.
And I think he's familiar with being in a major franchise, so that won't be a daunting thing for him.
Looks great in a tux.
Looks great in a tux.
In red carpets and stuff. Yeah.
So I mean, I don't know. I think that would be a good option.
Yeah.
But yeah,
I hope they're not too afraid of like nerds on the internet. Like, I hope they are willing to go for it. Like, because No Time to Die has some stuff in it that they've been willing to go for a more progressive Bond franchise entry, and I hope they are, well, let's say brave enough to go in that direction, because we know how angry and annoying film fans can be, unfortunately. But yeah, we'll see. But yeah, I'm excited regardless, because I feel like at this point with the Craig era, they've reached a level of relatively consistent quality that I hope goes on going forward. And they've also plucked really good, interesting directors, which is something that they didn't used to do as much. Like, they used to get more of a director for hire type person to do the movies, or somebody who had worked in like drama, but then they would be like, oh, but the second unit will focus on the action and stuff. And the fact that this series had Sam Mendes and even to some extent Yoji Fukunaga, who's a really interesting pick. I hope they continue to do that and give it to interesting, smart directors that have a vision for it.
You are right, Hugo, that the most recent movies where they've done that is new for the series. Like I don't know how many people know this. I think probably most people do, but casual in and out fans of Bond series may not. But this whole series, for its 50 plus years of existence, has been family run. It's basically a family business for the entire length of the series. It was started by Cubby Broccoli. His daughter and his adopted son picked it up in about the mid to late 80s and the 90s, and then they've run with it ever since. Mm-hmm. But they, that family business, you're right, Hugo, used to, especially in the 60s and 70s, they would basically just use the same team to make every single movie, and the next director that they would get used to be the second unit director, or he was the editor, or somebody else who worked on the film in a different capacity, and they would just go, here, we'll just get Billy to direct this one.
Yeah. But yeah, I think we've talked a bunch about Bond. We all have a lot to say. I feel like this series is at least extremely interesting in the way it fits into cinema, I feel. Whether you like most of the movies or not. But yeah, let's get into the film to remember this week, which is 1969's On Her Majesty's Secret Service. The film was released in 1969, and it was directed by Robert R. Hunt, which fits right into what you were saying, Matt, because Robert R. Hunt this was his directorial debut, but he had worked as an editor and second unit director in the previous entries in the series. So all the 5 movies that preceded it, he was working on them as an editor. He wanted the film to be different from the ones that came before, and I think by most accounts he pretty much succeeded, and it would be the last time that he worked on the series. So both him as the director and the actor, what's his name?
George Lazenby.
George Lazenby. Yeah, I was forgetting the George. It would be the first and last time they would have that role in the series. It was the first entry, as we were saying, that didn't star Sean Connery as Bond, as he had become tired of the series, although he would eventually return twice to it, which is interesting. And the only one to star George Lazenby. Lazenby had very little acting experience and wasn't the first choice for the film, but he caught Robert Broccoli's attention on an ad for something called Fry's Chocolate Cream, which I have no idea what that is, but hey.
Sounds super British, though.
It was ice cream.
Yeah, it sounds incredibly British. Many actors were considered for the role, and interestingly enough, one of the actors that were considered was a very young Timothy Dalton, who was in his early 20s, I guess, at this point, but he would eventually get the chance to play Bond in 2 movies in the 80s. And here on the notes, we have Matt, who apparently has a story of how Lazenby was cast.
Yeah, it's an awesome story. So George Lazenby was from us. I will. George Lazenby was from Australia. He grew up there. He grew up in a very kind of, working class background. He was a mechanic. He then was like a used car salesman, basically. Followed a girl that he knew to England, started being a model. He then started acting in some commercials, which is the Fry's chocolate cream commercial that you mentioned before. They even, apparently in the press, they even called him the Fry Guy.
Yeah.
that was his nickname. But basically, his agent said that she thought he would be great for the part of James Bond because she had heard that they were going to be recasting this role. There were a bunch of people who were already lined up, including Timothy Dalton, as you mentioned, a bunch of other actors. They had a predetermined list that they wanted to look at, and Lazenby was not on that list at all in the beginning. because again, he really didn't have any acting experience. He just appeared in a commercial, and that was pretty much it. So he knew that he needed to impress the team. He literally found out where Sean Connery got his haircut, which was the barbershop at the Dorchester Hotel, and he went and got a haircut from Sean Connery's barber. He went to where he somehow found out where Sean Connery got his dry cleaning done, and found out that they had a suit that had been ordered for Sean Connery that Connery never picked up. So he was like, screw it, I'll pick up the suit. He literally stole the suit from the dry cleaner. He didn't even pay for it. So he's got Connery's hair, he's got his suit. He said he already owned a Rolex, so he wore that. He said, and he basically went to the office. He tried to get in the door. They didn't let him in at first. So he kind of went away and then came back and rushed past the secretary or whatever into the casting director's office. He stood there at the door, and the casting director was on the phone. And he stood there at the door, and he kind of stood like this. And with it, the podcast listeners can't see, but basically he's got his wrist up near his face, and his sleeve was pulled down just enough so you could see the Rolex. And so he's standing there like this, and it catches the casting director's attention, and he says, well, what's your experience, your acting experience? And Lazenby just straight up lied. He was like, well, I've acted in the Ukraine, I've acted in China, and I've, all international stuff. And he says, in interviews, he says, yeah, I lied and told them all international stuff because I knew it would be difficult for them to check on it.
There's no letterboxd at the time.
There was no letterboxd.
No letterboxd, no IMDb, no nothing. Yeah. So apparently, what happened was he then said, the casting director said, we got to take you to Cubby and Harry Saltzman, the producers. Mm-hmm. They went. They really liked him at first. They actually had the director. He actually flew back from Switzerland where they were doing some location scouting specifically to meet him. And whenever he was sitting there one-on-one with the director, the producers were not there. And he told the director, the director said, so what have you acted in? What's your experience? He was kind of pissed that he had been flown back from Switzerland off of the location scouting he was trying to do. And apparently Lazenby just straight up was like, I got to be honest with you, man, I've never acted before. And the director was like, what? And apparently the director just started busting out laughing. And he said, dude, you say you're not an actor, but you just fooled and, got by two of the most ruthless guys in Hollywood. I would say you're an actor for sure. Stick with me, kid. I'm going to make you James Bond. It's the best story in history. He literally just faked his way into being James Bond.
Fake it till you make it,
Yeah.
Absolutely.
He lived it.
Yeah.
He did it. So, okay. Back to our boilerplates. The film also stars Diana Rigg as Contessa Teresa di Vincenzo, or Tracy Draco, if you want to make it easier.
I just want to say, last night Matt and I were talking about your outline here, Hugo, and I read through that, and I said her name, and I said, but Hugo will say it much better than I just did.
Well, there you go. And I mean, in my opinion, but I feel like in a lot of people's opinion, is one of the best quote-unquote Bond girls, I don't love using that term, of the series, and also stars Telly Savalas, I guess, as classic Bond villain and Stavro Blofeld. I think it was the second actor who played this character, because in the previous movie it was John Pleasance, or
he was
his name?
Donald Pleasance, and
Donald
he
Pleasance.
was the second Blofeld actor that you actually saw his face.
Yes. Okay, right. Because he does appear before as well. That's true. So the shoot for the film was apparently quite challenging, both because of the tough situation where they were shooting, because they were shooting in this remote location of Piz Gloria, or Gloria, whatever you want to call it, and which is the location in the Swiss Alps was a real place. It was a restaurant that was famous because it had we see at one point that the floor moves around, and that was something that really happened in the restaurant. So they chose it because it was a really cool place where they could shoot. Go ahead, man.
Yeah, I was going to add. Apparently, part of the reason that they chose this location was because they knew that it was going to be the headquarters for Blofeld, who's obviously the bad guy, and they liked that it resembled the Eagle's Nest, which was one of Hitler's most famous hideouts, which is same thing. It's at the very top of a mountain in the Alps, right? So they were like, oh, that looks like the Eagle's Nest. That's where Blofeld should be.
considering that it's a real place where people would go to eat, it's surprisingly perfect for the evil layer of this, supervillain or whatever. It really works well. But it was a really difficult place where to shoot a movie, and also because apparently Lazenby didn't have aside from not having acting experience, didn't really have a great relationship with the director, even though apparently he liked him at the beginning, but during the shoot at least, and with his co-stars, specifically Diana Rigg, who apparently is said to have eaten raw garlic right before all of their love scenes just to spite him, because they really didn't like each other apparently. Although in interviews, I think Lazenby denied this. He said, it was all kind of blown out of proportion, but
Diana...
That's the story, at least.
Diana Rigg, her interviews, kind of the similar thing. She basically said, there was one time where we all had lunch and we were going to be shooting one of the love scenes afterwards, and I ate something that had garlic in it.
Right.
And I think, to your point, Hugo, I think it was because of the purported, fact that they didn't get along very well. I'm sure,
it became
especially
a bigger story than it probably was.
Especially for the Times, right? I'm sure they would take a story like that and go, "Oh, this actress doesn't want to kiss James Bond, so she just ate raw garlic all the time."
And it's not like she can refute the
that.
point easily on Twitter,
Right.
Yeah.
Nowadays, if a reporter made up that story, the actor or actress would be on Twitter immediately like, "That's not true."
Right.
You're a liar.
Yeah.
You're just making it up. Yeah. The film made over $60 million at the box office in its original run, although apparently it made more with additional runs that it had later. But which, it would have been a great box office return for the $7 million budget, which is, relatively small compared to what it took in. But at the time, it was considered a disappointment because the previous entry in the series, which was the last one with Sean Connery, had made almost double the amount, and it was maybe one of the reasons why after that Sean Connery was sort of they managed to convince Sean Connery to come back, or at least they wanted him back. In terms of critical reception as well, at the time of release, the film received mixed reviews, especially because of Lazenby's performance. I think a lot of the mixed reviews at the beginning were sort of the shock of it not being Sean Connery, where at the time it wasn't. Yeah. We didn't have this idea of Bond as a character that would have many actors playing him. But notably, later on in over time, I guess the film has received some sort of critical reevaluation, with a lot of critics and directors as well now considering it one of the best entries in the series. One notable one is Christopher Nolan, who, of course, quoted this movie very directly, referenced it very directly in Inception. Because the ending in that snowy place where they have ski chases, and even the big layer that explodes is very similar to what we see in on Her Majesty's Secret Service. I have a quote. A lot of the reevaluation is because I feel like it's so different from the Bond movies from the movies before them, and even a lot of the Bond movies after it, because of the more serious tone, the way it sort of tries to humanize the character. And I feel like in many ways it is a precursor to Craig all those years later. That's
what was your quote, Matt?
You mentioned Christopher Nolan. I had a quote also from Steven Soderbergh, who's another big filmmaker, obviously, that counts this as one of his favorites. He says, "For me, there's no question that cinematically, On Her Majesty's Secret Service is the best Bond film and the only one worth watching repeatedly for reasons other than pure entertainment. Shot to shot, this movie is beautiful in a way that none of the other Bond films are." That is Steven Soderbergh.
Yeah, I will say, we'll talk about some action moments where the film looks a little dated, but I feel like visually it is a massive improvement over the movies that came before. There's a lot of creative shots, there's a lot of really cool, interesting transitions. There's that one where he's looking outside of a window to a pool, and on the pool we see the projection of the word casino. Yeah. And then it cuts to the casino. There's all that sort of very interesting visual details that maybe some of the movies that came before didn't really have. Even though, the movies that came before had some really iconic imagery as well. In terms of premise, what happens in this movie? So, in the opening scene of the film, we see Bond driving his Aston Martin down a road, and he meets a woman who races him, but she seems to race him, but then she stops at a beach, and she's apparently suicidal, and he saves her, and he gets into a fight with some goons that we don't really understand who they are, and then she runs away from him. And this is all before the credits, and the final thing that he says at the end of the credits is a very cheeky line where he almost looks straight into the camera and says, "This never happened to the other guy," which is, I think, a very cool way to introduce the idea that this movie is going to be different, and you know, he's not going to be exactly like Sean Connery.
Yeah, well, and it's a good way to like kind of laugh off the criticism that this isn't he's not Sean Connery. Like, yeah, no, I know I'm not Sean Connery. I'm not trying to be Sean Connery.
Yeah. Well, and then it goes into the credits too, and the credits show all of the images of the past Bond movies. So that, you know, it's been said that this was those two things, the line and all the images in the credit sequence, as well as a later scene where he starts finding like items from his past missions from the other movies. It's all a way that the filmmakers were trying to say, like, no, this is the same James Bond that you guys saw before. Like, this is still the same character.
Yeah, but we're aware that you know that it isn't exactly the same.
Yeah.
Right.
So it was good. So he eventually meets this woman again at his hotel, and they sleep together. And then but he seems to be taken by her, and he is eventually taken in by. He's brought in by her father, I guess, who is this Draco character, who's I think in the movie he's described as the second biggest crime syndicate leader in the world behind Blofeld. And basically the premise of the movie is that Bond is going to build a relationship with Tracy, the girl who he met, who's Draco's daughter, and Draco is going to give him a hint of where Blofeld might be, and so Bond will try to track down Blofeld and take down his organization. I think that's the premise of the movie. We'll get more into the plot later, but before, let's talk about the movie in general. So, what do you guys think of this film? I think we all had it on our top 5, or maybe
I did not.
Jeff didn't,
it's
but...
number 7 for me.
Right. So it's still
very high. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's my third favorite film. I when I found out that we were kind of changing to this one instead of License to Kill, I was definitely not sad at all because I love this film overall. I think it's
and you like License to Kill as well.
And I very much like License to Kill. I think this movie, one of the things that I like about it is that it's one of the few Bond movies where we truly get to see Bond. Well, we'll talk about it in a lot more detail, but we get to see Bond as a human, right?
Yeah.
To your point of what you said before, Hugo, he's not a larger than life figure that, you know, is superhuman in every way, like he is in some of the. I mean, frankly, every actor that has portrayed him has elements of that in their portrayal. Yeah. But this is one of the few movies where he's actually a human person with human feelings and things that happen to him and vulnerabilities, right? So that's, I think, the biggest thing I like about it.
In addition to those things, what I really like about Lazenby's performance in this movie is a lot to do with his physical presence. He carries himself like a spy, like a super spy, right? He's like, we already talked about how, like, you know, he's a well-built guy, muscular, you know, very fit and all that. But you know, it fits the character in a great way, just from how it looks, but also the way he carries himself, very upright, very confident in everything. It does make his disguise as Hillary somewhat humorous to me, which is I kind of appreciate, because like he honestly, like he looks like an American football linebacker wearing a nerd disguise. Is like which I get a kick out of that. So I and as far as like line delivery, considering this guy didn't have previous acting history, pretty solid. Like really not a bad actor, and which is why when we talked about it having some negative reviews when it came out, I'm like, were these guys watching the same movie? Because like he's pretty good.
Yeah.
They were all butthurt that it wasn't Connery.
Yeah. I think it's just that, because honestly I feel like the movie is really strong, and for me it aside from the stuff that you said, and I completely agree that it's finally a movie where Bond is a human, and it's just easier to connect to the character and care about what's happening to him in this one than the previous ones. It's also the first one where I feel like the plot and the characters are melded in a better way. I feel like the plot and the different plot lines all build up to the progression of the film. The film doesn't feel as episodic to me. It always feels like the next scene is a consequence of the scene before, and there aren't as many moments where I'm like, oh, okay, now we're having an action scene, because there hasn't been an action scene for a while. Like, every time we get action, it's because it fits into what's happening in the story. Every time we get a quieter moment, it's because it fits what is happening in the story. And I think more so than the Connery movies, it really feels like a modern film in terms of story. There are some things that are dated, and we'll talk about them, but in terms of how the story progresses, it feels much more modern than a lot of the movies of the time, and even to a lot of the Roger Moore movies for me.
And to your point about the episodic nature of a lot of the other Bond movies, we don't get the monster of the week moments that we get in the other movies with the henchmen. Maybe it's because the henchmen in this movie aren't as iconic, but they're not meant to be. You don't have a Jaws, you don't have an Odd Job, you don't have these other henchmen characters that show up multiple times throughout the movie, inexplicably to pick fights with no explanation for how they got there. Everything,
it just kind of feels more grounded and kind of realistic. I mean, there's always some fantastical stuff, of course, but
if there wasn't fantastical stuff, it wouldn't be a Bond movie. So,
exactly,
right.
I think this one strikes the good balance that you want for that stuff.
Absolutely. So yeah, I think we talked about Lazenby. I feel like Lazenby does really well in this movie. I mean, he's not as charismatic as Connery, but who is? And considering again that he hasn't had any acting experience, I thought he was pretty good. Like, his presence is fantastic. I agree. Like, whenever there's a fight scene or an action scene or any scene where he has to do anything physical, I feel like he's extremely believable in the role.
There's weight behind his movements.
Absolutely,
that you don't get from Roger Moore so much. Not that Roger Moore is bad in the action scenes, but it really, he just doesn't have the same physical presence that Sean Connery had or that Lazenby has, and
So I feel like the movie is basically divided into two big plot lines. One is the relationship that he's building with Tracy, and the other is the big plot that Blofeld is doing, and we're trying to stop. Do you feel like those two are melded together well, or do you think that overall maybe one of them is weaker than the other ones? Do you think Blofeld is a good villain in this one? Do you think Diana Rigg is a good character in this one, or Tracy is a good character in this one? Because for me, I feel like there's a pretty good balance. I think at the end, I care much more about Bond's relationship with Tracy, because it's so different from the other movies than the overall plot of what Blofeld is doing. But still, I think it all serves to create a cohesive film, which I really enjoy.
I mostly agree with that, Hugo. I think both of the major. You are right. There's two major things going on in this movie, right? The relationship and the stuff with Blofeld. I feel like those two story elements are strong together, strong on their own.
Yeah.
I think that they are melded together mostly in a good way. Except I feel like the movie spends the first 45 minutes of the movie building this initial relationship with Bond and Tracy, and then Tracy disappears for almost an hour.
Yeah, that was what I was going to say. It's disjointed from each other for a good portion of the movie.
Yeah, and then she comes back, and when she comes back, that's when they start to meld a lot more closely, and that's when it gets really strong, I feel like. But I wish there was more of that interplay between the two in the meantime, and that it didn't only happen once we hit the hour 40 mark.
I agree, but I also think that the story that they're telling allows for that to be relatively organic, because it's still he's going to this remote location and he's trying to catch Blofeld.
Yeah, he's not going to bring Tracy with him.
Exactly. Tracy wouldn't have a role in that, and I feel like if they tried to put her in there, it would, I don't know, it wouldn't necessarily work.
It wouldn't make any sense.
At the same time, I feel like what the movie is doing is trying to tell you, Bond for the first time is bringing his guard down, and he's going to have an actual connection to a person, and he's going to fall in love. And what he does in the mountains, because I think of the era where the movie was made and what the sort of the idea of Bond was in the 60s, doesn't completely fit in with that, but I sort of forgive it in the movie. I think we'll get into it when we get through the plot, but I'm sure you know what I'm referring to.
Yeah.
But still, overall, I think the movie is really strong structurally in that sense. Okay, let's get into a plot. I'll try to get through the plot as quickly as possible, and we'll stop and talk about different scenes, different moments that we liked, disliked, and discuss them. So, after that premise, Draco, as I was saying, is brought in by Bond is brought in by Draco's men, and he is offered information on Blofeld, as long in a very transactional way as he continues to romance Tracy. Draco wants him to eventually marry her, and he sort of represents the strong patriarchal figure of her family, where I think he literally says, "Oh, she's a rebel, but she just needs a strong man to dominate her." I think those are his literal words, and I like how they plant that element in there and use Tracy in the movies to push back against that. And it's very clear that despite his intentions with that, she's very independent from her father, and she doesn't take his, sort of old, dated ways. So at this point, Bond goes back to London. The leader of the MI6
I do want to say
unit.
that conversation where Draco says she needs a man to dominate her and all that stuff. That is, and obviously that's a very dated thing. But it is like I almost laugh because I'm like, how the hell does Bond not say, "Dude, you can't talk like that"?
Yeah. I mean,
he does push back on it
a little bit, but
because he says what she needs is a psychiatrist.
Yeah. I was like, whoa, dominate her? Come on, man, you're her father.
Yeah. It's weird. Like, it's definitely weird. At the same time, this character is... I think it gets lost in the movie that this character is supposed to be like the second biggest crime syndicate leader in the world. And we kind of lose that thread later on in the movie.
Because so much of his time on screen is about him trying to get Bond to seduce his daughter.
To help Bond, yeah. Right. Yes. Or to help him get Blofeld, because this guy sees Blofeld as a competition, and he wants to take him out.
That should have been a bigger focus, but I don't think it comes across as big of a focus as it should have been. But I also can't get over how much I every time I see Draco on screen, I think he looks like Walt Disney.
Yeah, he's like, okay, he's a horrible person for what he tries to do for his daughter, but he's also they also managed to make him this funny, likable character.
He's kind of likable, yeah.
He is likable.
I think it's because he looks like Walt Disney.
He's like this weird Italian guy who's like, oh yeah, sure, we'll get helicopters and go kill people. Why not?
Yeah.
I don't know. He's funny. So anyway, Bond goes back to London.
Come to my birthday where we do bullfighting.
Yes, sure. Why not? In Corsica. Yeah, that's what happens. We'll do that.
Typical Italian birthday.
Typical Italian birthday, yeah, absolutely. So Bond goes back to London, and M puts him off Blofeld's case, but because he hasn't apparently made any progress in the last 2 years, he hasn't been able to find him. And Bond threatens to resign, and we get a really clever scene where Moneypenny, who's the classic secretary character to M, manages to sort of diffuse this situation this tension that was building between the two characters, and she manages to get him off with like 2 weeks leave. Sorry, where after the 2 weeks leave, he's just gonna go investigate Blofeld. But MI6 isn't really a big element of this movie. He's sort of doing his own thing, and he's just trying to get Blofeld independently. And the movie really begins in the next scene, as you said, the Draco's birthday party. He shows up again, and Tracy shows up too, but she manages to guess that her dad is trying to set her up with Bond, and there's sort of this weird transaction between them that, if you romance my daughter, I will give you information on Blofeld. And she basically... Sorry, I'm going to have to pause. Josh, pause.
Still pause. He's still dying.
Yeah. Sorry. Jeff, I'm not doing great. Do you mind taking over the plot?
I don't. Do you want to go grab some water real quick, bud?
Yeah, I'm going to have a glass of water. I'm sorry. It's just that I had this cold, and the talking has been making it worse.
Okay, drink some water, stop coughing, and then I'll start talking again.
Actually, if we're taking a break, I'm going to run to the bathroom. Can I do that?
Yeah, go real quick.
I mean, I'm not going to take my time.
Go real quick. We're still in a hold, Josh. We're still in a hold.
We'll let you know when we get back. I'm sorry.
Hi.
Have you guys had to pause like this before?
Yeah, this happens all the time.
Okay.
Okay, I'll just go back and say, this was a weird cut. We're going to switch over to Jet to Grizz doing the plot just because I had an uncontrollable fit of coffee.
Yeah, just tell me you have a sore throat, and I'm gonna take over the rest of the plot.
Yeah, I'll do that.
I mean, where are we? Let me find it.
We're at, Draco's birthday.
Okay.
Okay, so for you, Josh, 3, 2, 1. So this is a weird cut, but I just had I have a sore throat, so we had to stop the podcast for a second. Don't worry, no COVID or anything. I got tested. I'm vaccinated. I'm fine. But I think Grizz is going to take over narrating the plot, and I'll comment on it, so I don't have to talk as much.
So get ready for the dulcet tones of Jeff Grizz Ulrich.
Yes, so get ready for this very Americanized version of a Bond movie.
Oh, said with such disdain.
Yeah. I could put on a fake British accent if you'd like, if that would make you feel better.
Please don't. That would be funny. But...
I'm really tempted. They all meet at Draco's birthday party, but Tracy guesses her father's intentions and shows her independence by forcing him to give Bond the information anyway. She runs away in tears, but Bond goes after her and tells her he really does care about her. This, as Hugo points out in the note, kind of the first indication that Tracy is not going to be like all the other Bond girls. She's an independent woman and is very capable. Handles herself well, despite her father's, impressions of her.
I think it's also the first indication that we get to see that, just like Bond, Tracy is also a broken individual, right? Like, she's dealt with a lot in her life. She can tell when people are trying to take advantage of her, and to her it's just another indication that a guy that she kind of had a good time with earlier, right? Like they kind of make that pretty clear in the film before, is just somebody who is just using her just like everybody else in her life has, right? And I think that's one of the biggest or strongest points of the movie is that Bond and Tracy are both broken people who find each other, and I mean, we'll get into the rest of it later, but
yes.
And it's also interesting that Bond shows that he wasn't in it for the transaction, like, because he got the information, he could have let her go, but he still goes to her, and so you can tell that somehow the few moments that they had before were different for him too. It wasn't just another girl he slept with among the hundreds, I guess, but he had a connection to her, and so he wants to get to know her anyway.
But then we get a really nice montage of them getting to know each other and developing a bond. Thank you for writing that joke into the notes, Hugo.
I will leave now.
But yeah, so they go through a montage, and it's a montage. It's not.
It's a great soundtrack over the top of it.
Is
with
really
Louis
good,
Armstrong.
good music with Louis there, and
that was one of his last recordings he ever did before he died about a year later. So yeah, and he did it in one take apparently.
It's not
old one take Louis. That's what they called him.
Definitely not Satchmo.
It's not necessarily the most elegant way to do romance in films, but I feel like for 1969 standards, and considering it was a Bond movie they manage to sort of they do really give you the idea, oh, these people are really into each other at this point, even if they could have showed a bit more.
And there's something to be said for montages being a film technique that viewers know, like, oh, this is a montage and it shows them talking all the time. That means they're falling in love. So they don't actually have to spell it out for you, because we've seen movies and we know that that's what this sequence means.
It's an economic way to do it, for sure.
So eventually Bond follows Draco's information and breaks into the office of a lawyer who has some ties with Blofeld. Hugo thinks this is a really cool scene. What does he like about this scene, Hugo?
I think the way that he sneaks into the office is so, like, there's no brute force involved. It's like a very clever way. He knew when he was going to be on a lunch break, and he had a guy with him that's going to pass him this weird machinery that he's going to use to copy all his documents, and then he just casually walks out right when he was about to come back. And
some might say almost too casually, considering he's holding a Playboy pinup as he's walking out of the office.
Yeah,
and still folding it up with like the boobs hanging out everywhere.
Like, it's so smooth, and I feel like it gives me a really satisfying feeling that you get when in a heist movie, they pull off a part of the heist so perfectly and nobody notices. It's a very satisfying scene to watch.
Yeah, well, especially in comparison to a lot of other Bond movies, where like every time, like sometimes in Bond movies, I start to think, Bond's really not that good at being a spy.
He gets caught.
He gets caught all the time.
Also, he almost always uses his real name,
he introduces
or at least
himself.
the slightest variation of his real name, like James, like Slog or whatever, right? You're like,
hi, I'm James Band.
Yeah. Also, that
scene.
I do think that scene is kind of funny in the sense that, like, the whole reason that it works is because the lawyer's office just so coincidentally happens to be right next to the construction site that is being manned by Draco's men. So they can use a crane to basically lift a BMW through the window to be able to unlock this safe.
Now, if you want to justify it and make it more justifiable in your head, maybe Draco bought the construction site so they could do this heist.
The fact Draco had the information, so he was definitely already, sort of monitoring this person, because he was trying to get to Blofeld, because for him, he was the competition and he wanted to take him out.
That explanation I like better.
The crane swinging like this supercomputer / hacking device, into like the crane slams into the side of the building.
Yeah. That would have absolutely destroyed the building.
Oh, it's so
fine.
But that's I do really enjoy the scene, and it is really cool. And this is one of those examples of a Bond gadget doing cool things in a way that kind of makes can make sense without being campy. So I do really like that as well. He finds out that Blofeld is trying to claim the title of Count Balthazar de Beauchamp, so he goes undercover as Sir Hilary Bray, the genealogist that was corresponding with him at his research center in the Swiss Alps. This setting is really cool. The Swiss Alps, like we talked about it earlier, the Swiss Alps, absolutely flawless, perfect setting for a Bond movie, and basically sets up the future of all Bond movies. This is the gold standard.
It's so crazy that this is a real place that they managed to find, and that it looks so perfect for what they're going for in the movie.
It's really cool that it can be, basically only accessed by helicopters too, right? Because like it sets up so many cool shots for the cinematography in the movie too.
But here's where he goes undercover as Hilary Bray. This is where I wanted to again mention how silly this disguise looks, because it basically looks like Sherlock Holmes.
Yeah.
He's got a big, and not like the Benedict Cumberbatch Sherlock Holmes, like like how you imagine Sherlock Holmes before the Sherlock TV show.
Yeah.
Big brown coat.
An interesting side note for this little bit is that the voice he gets his voice dubbed over throughout this whole sequence when he is Sir Hilary Bray, and the person doing the dubbing is the guy who played the actual character of Sir Hilary Bray that we just saw in the scene right before. And the whole reason they did it that way.
That was really funny.
Yeah, the whole reason they did it that way was because they wanted Lazenby to do an impression of the guy, and apparently the director was like, no, that's not good enough. Let's just have that guy do the voiceover.
That's crazy.
That's really funny.
But like, I kind of like these guys in the way because like it's kind of funny that you get Bond, who's supposed to be like the coolest guy ever, and you put him in this like really turn him into this really nerdy, boring dude who can talk about genealogy for like 4 hours. Like, it's strange.
And he does talk about it for 4 hours because he talks about
really
it
funny
with Blofeld's Angels of Death, which are a group of beautiful girls that Blofeld is programming to be his perfect killers. He will have them distribute his virus whenever he tells them to through hypnotherapy. So Bond investigates this whole situation and, of course, sleeps with a few of the girls. 2 of them.
Yeah, and this is
one
what I was
or two.
referring. Yeah, this is what I was referring to before, where it feels like he sleeps with the girls because Bond sleeps with girls, and it has to be part of the movie, but it doesn't really completely fit into this movie. It kind of devalues like the relationship building that they'd been doing with Tracy, and the fact that the movie is, this is the movie where Bond falls in love for the first time, but he's still sleeping around with these 2 other girls. It feels like, I don't know, they threw that in just almost because they had to, because that's the character, but I don't think it really works in this movie at all.
To your point,
Also,
Hugo, it's not...
Also, why are they into him? Because he's playing the most boring guy in the world, as we said.
It's because he's a model.
Maybe, I suppose.
He's the very model of a modern James Bond.
Well, I was going to say, to your point, Hugo, it's not even like they have him sleep with these girls because they are crucial to furthering the plot or him getting more information or whatever. It's literally just like, here are 2 girls that are hot. I'm going to sleep with them.
I mean, so technically he does get some information from them because he finds out more about what's going on, and you know, there's that scene where he's present when one of them is getting hypnotized, but I don't think we really need to have him sleep with them. Like, we just could have had a scene where maybe one of them comes onto him and sneaks into his room, but he doesn't actually sleep with them, but then the hypnotism starts, and that's how he learns that there's something going on there or something like that. And I don't know, the fact that he sleeps with him feels like sort of something that they had to have in the movie just because it's Bond and it's the 60s.
And it does kind of cheapen the relationship that he has been building with Tracy a little bit.
However, that
is
that is a cool scene though, where he's with the girl as the hypnotizing is going on, because it gives you that late 60s like hypnotic colors, acid trip effect.
The way they visualize the idea of the hypnotizing is awesome. Like, I think it's really cool. Like, this idea that, as soon as that happens, she just shuts off and she's listening, and he realizes that something's going on because it doesn't have an effect on him yet. Yeah, that's really good.
Bond investigates and tries to trick Blofeld into leaving Switzerland so he can be arrested, but eventually Blofeld discovers Bond and captures him, and in classic 007 film fashion, explains his entire plan to him. Although I did think it was really funny. He starts to explain the plan, but then Bond asks him, like, "But what about this?" And then he's like, "Well, that's going to be my little secret." And it's like, okay, Blofeld, you just went off for like 5 minutes explaining everything. You're like, "Oh, but this is a bridge too far, Bond.
There's
I'm
that
not sharing
little
that."
nugget of information that I'm not going to get.
Only to go,
Yeah. Blofeld has developed a virus that can target entire strains of crops or livestock and will threaten the UN, demanding amnesty and the recognition of the aristocratic title that he is going for. Which, to me, that seems a little silly. Like, once you've... Like, is the title really worth anything when you've already made an enemy of the entire planet?
I think there's a moment where they say the title is his pension plan or whatever, because it's like it comes with land and money, but I don't think it doesn't seem to me that Blofeld really needs.
Yeah, he's already got
he seems to be doing all right.
Lair, dude, just chill out here, man.
Yeah.
Also, it makes it seem like when you're in that lifestyle, you can just choose to retire.
Sure. Yeah. I'll just I'll just get
I'm done
my
being a super
royalty
criminal.
house and now.
Yeah.
I'm done, Bond. I'm going off to sleep with my harem of angels of death.
I'm gonna go play golf.
I mean, yeah, maybe. But
Bond,
yeah, it's a far-fetched plan, but it's a fun plan. I feel like regardless of how kind of stupid it is and over the top it is, it's still a fun Bond villain plan. Like, it's
agreed. It's
you know?
it's a semi-plausible concept.
Yes.
You know?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not as crazy as some others.
Not as crazy as some of the other ones. And some of them are really crazy.
Oh, yeah.
Bond manages to escape, and we get the most well-known set piece of the film, the ski chase, which leads into Bond meeting Tracy again and continues into a car chase through the Alps. This is the first of many ski chases in Bond history. I don't know how that became such a staple. I don't know, maybe Roger Moore saw Lazenby do this, and he's like, I want to do that, but like 4 more times.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's iconic.
It was probably just because this one was so good. Like, I mean, I don't know how you guys felt, but I love this sequence. I think it's awesome. I think the way that it's shot and edited together, I think, is awesome. They have the whole. There's one scene that I really love where it was obviously shot from a helicopter because it shows 4 skiers going down like on top of the crest of the mountain.
Yeah,
like it's
really
so
cool.
cool.
Oh, that's a beautiful shot. Yeah.
And even though the dummies that they drop off the cliff sides, like as far as dummies go, they I mean, obviously they're dummies, but like it's
could have been worse.
Could have been much worse.
You don't see the straw flying out as they're dropping.
Exactly.
Like
that guy fell for like a minute and a half.
Oh yeah, for me, but it gives you an idea of how high they really are.
Yeah,
I think that was good. Overall, I think the scene is really good. I do feel like everything that they shot on location is so much better than whenever they cut where they want to actually show the actors' faces, and it's very clearly them shot against the background.
Yeah.
But regardless of that, I think the whole sequence is really cool because I especially like how it escalates because it begins with him, stuck in that place where he's trying to escape. Then he manages to get out of the place, and the way he does is really creative. He climbs over the place, and then he steals some skis, and then he starts skiing down, and then he falls off the skis. And then, he finally manages to get to the little village down, and he meets her again, which is kind of a weird reveal of the movie. And then she becomes the one who's in charge of the chase.
Yeah.
Because they go to her car, and she's the driver. And this is another moment where, we get a lot of Tracy being really capable and awesome. She kicks ass in this movie.
She really does.
And
the car chase is really cool too, right? And
the car chase is really good.
So apparently the car chase was actually, like, that's not shot with them driving against a green screen. That's them shooting in that actual environment. Like, they actually did that.
Yeah.
Which is really expensive.
So cool. Yeah.
But it pays off. Like, the practical, like, during the ski chase, there's some close-up moments where they do a close-up on, like, Blofeld. There's a close-up on him. And it's very clearly done on a green screen. But so like when you see the car chase and you can tell that it's not being done in a a warehouse, it's really cool. That they went all out with that car chase. And as far as the stuff with Tracy, because she's so capable and they've done such a good job of showing how capable she is, it really makes sense why she is a person that Bond would fully fall for. Yeah. Because she can keep up with him on this level, and so it makes their love story make that much more sense.
And I also really like that they bring back this idea that she's an expert driver, just like Bond, because at the beginning of the film, the first time she shows up is when they are racing through the hills of, I think it was Corsica at the time, and which is a scene that we'll see in a few other Bond movies. I think there's one in GoldenEye. There's one even in I mean, there's references to it in one of Craig's movies. Like, it's a famous kind of iconic Bond thing that he meets somebody else and he races them through the hills. And the fact that they plant that idea and then they reuse it here is really fun for me.
So, Bond and Tracy confessing their love and getting engaged. How do you feel about that? Does it feel premature? I mean, I know I already stated how I kind of feel about it, that like it makes sense to me. I think they're getting in any movie like this, when they get engaged and they've known each other a collective 3 weeks, that feels a bit quick, but like in terms of reality. But does it feel earned in terms of the narrative of the movie?
I think it does overall, because it's still there's a lot of 60s romance movies that the escalation of the romance is a little quick and it feels a little jarring maybe to a modern perception, but I think the facade of film was something that people accepted more at the time, and now we want everything to be a little more realistic. Again, there's always that little blemish of the fact that Bond has slept around with other women in the meantime, but I don't mind. I think their relationship is strong. I think they have chemistry on screen, despite the fact that maybe they didn't like each other apparently, but it kind of works for me. And it's also like, I like the quirky scene where Bond is like, oh, but now I'm not going to be promiscuous. I'm going to wait until marriage. And they obviously don't.
Yeah.
It's a fun gag because of who Bond is and the fact that they've already slept with together. So
I like it. I don't think it feels unearned. I think that they had already done enough in that movie to point out the fact that Tracy is very different from every other woman that we've seen in these movies so far, right? They like I mentioned before, they also done a very good job about showing that they are they're two people who are very alike in the sense that they are both broken people, right? And they don't necessarily like fix each other's holes, but they at least can see each other in the other, right? And I think that for those reasons, I don't feel like it feels unearned. Yeah, it's a little quick, but I mean, it's a movie, right? Like
it's a movie.
Yeah. You can't show a whole gigantic courtship like that. And I do like the way that it's actually shot too. Like it's really it's kind of old timey in the sense that they do like the I forget the word for it, but it's basically like when they smudge the Vaseline on it a little bit on the lens, right? And it's like kind of gives it the fog of romance or whatever. And I don't mind that. I like it. I think it gives a nice little touch to the scene.
Okay, well, so back in London, Bond is informed that the UN has chosen to give in to Blofeld's demands, so he decides to go rogue and attack Blofeld's compound with the help of Draco. This assault is the second big set piece of the film. How do you feel about that?
I love the helicopter shots.
The helicopter shots are awesome. I don't know, like it feels really modern, like in a way that a lot of the action in the other Bond movies of the 60s I don't think does. Like the fact that they assault this place, they land with the helicopters, and then it moves into this fight through the compound, and there's a lot of like whenever it gets where they're fighting hand to hand, it always seems pretty realistic. The editing is frenetic in a way that feels modern. I think it really holds up as a sequence.
I agree with that. I think that my favorite part about it is honestly the helicopters as they're flying in, Draco's convincing them that like, no, we're on a mercy mission. It had a very Han Solo quality to it. And I really enjoyed that moment, and then it pays off with an excellent fight scene, and then the blowing up of Peace Gloria is impressive because obviously they didn't actually blow up the restaurant that they were shooting in. So they're very effective effects there.
Yeah. I'm assuming by miniatures. I don't know how
it's got to be
otherwise you would do
miniatures,
that.
but they were fantastic miniatures. Fantastic miniatures. And it's tough. Explosions, and this is something that anyone who considers himself even remotely a film buff is aware of. Explosions and fire in miniatures are really tough to do, especially in purely practical ways like they were doing it at this time, because fire doesn't move the same way on a small scale as it does on a large scale. You can't change the size of fire. You know what I mean? So
you can't scale it down.
You can't scale it down to a very tiny.
Like today, today they wouldn't use a miniature at all. But even if in the few films that they do use miniatures, they enhance it with CGI,
Correct.
and so it looks more real. But
so this is a very impressive practical effect that they're doing there. Bond and Blofeld have their final showdown in a bobsled, which I think is amusing. Because
it's a little silly, but also fun. So
it's the right amount of silliness for me for a Bond movie. Like how do you end up in this situation? Like unbelievable that they would do it, but then also like a really cool and visceral way to kill Blofeld as he gets his head stuck in a tree branch, and makes a little snapping sound indicating his neck is broken. And you're like, oh, damn, there goes Blofeld, okay.
Oh, we never have to worry about him again. Oh, wait, next movie.
Oh, wait, later in this movie.
Yeah, that's true, too, yeah.
Bond and Tracy get married and then drive away in his Aston Martin, which is a lovely scene when he says, no need to go too fast. We have all the time in the world. But then, of course, Blofeld is not dead. He has teamed up with Frau Blucher, or whatever her name is.
No.
in the
I don't
Frau
remember.
Blucher.
Yeah, we didn't mention, but she basically, this woman is one of the people who were at his service or something.
Yeah, one of his henchmen.
Frau Blucher is good enough.
Yeah, and she is driving a car, and they do a drive-by shooting of Bond and Tracy in the Aston Martin, and Bond's like, gosh darn it, that Blofeld, he's alive. Oh, he gets into his car and is like, oh damn. Tracy's been shot in the face. So
it turns out that she's dead, unfortunately.
Yeah. And when I first saw this movie, I was really shocked by that. Like, I knew from later movies that Bond was not still married, but I guess I had always assumed that it was something that happened off screen, like they just didn't bring the actress back. But then when I first saw this movie, I'm like, oh no, they show her getting killed. No coming back from that.
For Bond fans who, I can't even imagine what that must have felt like in the theaters when you're first seeing that movie for the first time. Because again, you got to remember, at that point, they didn't know what Bond was going to be after that, right? So it's the first movie where they would have seen Bond actually fall in love for real with, another person and get married, and you see their relationship, and then gone.
Yeah,
right? Like,
in an instant, as quick, almost like quicker than it came, and it came really quick.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
It's
a devastating ending for a character that they did a really good job building up, for the whole movie.
Mm-hmm. And I really like Lazenby's performance here, honestly. Like, the critics at the time didn't like him, but I think in this ending, he does have the humanity that you need to play this scene. And, this idea of this character who is fundamentally broken, has never cared about anyone because he's just all about Her Majesty's Secret Service. And the one time that he, becomes vulnerable and falls in love, his life catches up to him, and she gets killed.
You almost would think that this would be the sort of story that they would have told before he became a womanizer.
Almost.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're when they were shooting that scene, I read that basically he had originally filmed that scene actually tearing up and actually crying, because he doesn't really in the movie. You can tell he's kind of choked up, but you don't see any tears or anything like that. But they had filmed it that way to begin with. And basically the reason they decided not to do that was because the director said, James Bond doesn't cry.
Yeah.
And then,
sure.
and I look at it now and I'm like, what a dumb decision. Like,
yep.
Literally, if there were any point in Bond's life where you would want him to cry, it would be after his wife gets murdered the minute they get married. Like, and I think they remedy that decision, 30, 40 years later with Daniel Craig in Casino Royale, right? But it's such a wasted opportunity, I feel. I feel like it would have been better if we did see him cry in that moment. And I think another thing I'll add to this scene, they at the end, they kind of the music is very soft and obviously sad and somber. It's the We Have All the Time in the World song, but instrumental version. And it peters out with the movie. The credits start to roll, and it's still that same soft music, and it holds it for like 5 seconds, and then all of a sudden it goes "Plada, plada, plada," and I'm like, what are you doing, man?
Yeah, I agree.
From a filmmaking perspective, like, you just ruined the tone
chill.
that you set up.
Like, can you slow down for 5 minutes and then you do the Bond theme? No, they're just gonna do that. But
they went
I really like
it's this moment. I want to give you the quote here, Hugo.
Right,
that Bond takes her into his arms after she's been shot and says, "It's all right. She's just having a rest. There's no hurry. You see, we have all the time in the world." And that's like a really broken thing to say. His mind has snapped here. Very powerful.
It's a final line of the movie, and then the camera just moves over, and we see the bullet hole through the windshield, and that's it. That's the end of the movie, and the credits start
Yep.
playing. And then I agree
then-
with you, Matt. Like, we only get those 5 seconds of somber music, and then the Bond theme just shows up, and it's like, it's a little off. But, you know, at the time, credit sequences weren't that long, so I guess they wanted to have the whole song for the end of the movie, but still.
Yeah, it's like we didn't need the reminder that this is a Bond movie. We know
we
that.
get it. Yeah.
Like,
Yeah, and
Keep-
it would have
keep
been
the
much
tone.
more.
Still-
It would have been much more poignant if they had kept that tone all the way through the end there.
Yeah.
Can you imagine like walking out of the theater with that sad, ending instead of the swinging Bond?
cool, James Bond is coming back. See you in another year.
Yeah, but still, I think the ending is one of the darkest ending for any Bond movie.
Yeah,
For sure.
it's up there.
Definitely.
It's up
before.
there.
I haven't seen License to Kill, and I hear that one's pretty dark. I don't know how the ending is, but still, definitely before the Daniel Craig era, this is not what Bond movies usually were. And
And then they weren't again.
and then they weren't
quite
again for a
some
long
time.
while.
Yeah.
And I like how it breaks from tradition, because I think it completes this idea of the movie, which is to make James Bond a human being, like to put him through the suffering that he goes through at the end of the movie, sort of brings him back to maybe the old Bond, because he would revert back to his old life because he doesn't want to feel anything anymore.
Yeah.
But I think it's a really poignant ending, and I really like the ending. I think
Yeah.
I wasn't even necessarily expecting it, because I thought the movie, I don't know if the movie could have been a happily ever after, because it's just not what this character gets, but I don't know, the ending did catch me by surprise, and I really appreciated that.
So here we'll jump into our final discussion.
Yep.
The film is often considered to be a more serious take on Bond. I think we've made that abundantly clear. And it's more faithful to the novels and less fantastical than some of the previous, and certainly more so than the following entries, which do get pretty silly at times. In contrast to the rest of the series, it almost feels like a deconstruction of the character and an anticipation of what Craig's Bond would eventually be. Obviously, these notes were written by Hugo, and I took over. So those were Hugo's words.
There you go.
Do I agree? Yeah, I mean this movie, I think, more so than more. I don't necessarily want to say that it sets up Daniel Craig so much as I think it sets up Timothy Dalton, and then Timothy Dalton sets up Daniel Craig.
Yes.
Because I do think you need that step in between in terms of the seriousness to kind of find that sweet spot. And so but in general, yeah, obviously there's a through line between this performance, George Lazenby, to Timothy Dalton, to Daniel Craig, and thematically, and I think you can really see that. What do you think, Matt?
I think it does a nice job of setting up, not necessarily setting up any one particular actor or one particular portrayal, but it does a great job of setting the stage for it's okay if we have a more humanistic, more vulnerable James Bond on screen, right? And I think they didn't necessarily know it at the time, but obviously for modern audiences these days, that is really what I think makes the Daniel Craig era work, is that it is a much more human James Bond than we've had in the past. And I think modern audiences generally want that.
Yeah.
For sure.
And it's honestly
Hugo,
the
do you have
reason
anything you want to
why-
add to that?
Yeah, I think it's honestly the reason why the later Brosnan movies just didn't really find any appreciation from. I don't think anyone thinks those movies are fantastic, because it's just like, it feels like at that point it's so dated that would still be the formula, and it just doesn't work.
Yeah. Well, so last one of our last questions here. We talked a lot about some of the dated features of Bond movies, the traditional Bond elements, which are still in this film. Does it ruin it for you? Does it ruin any of it for you? Or are the ways in which it subverts the character and the formula of the previous movies, are those enough to overcome those more dated elements?
Yeah, for me, it is overall a movie that I really like, and I think it's an extremely strong entry in the series, especially for the 60s. I sort of forgive the fact, again, the sleeping with the other girls is just does not fit this movie at all for me. It just feels completely out of place, but I understand where it comes from, where it's just like maybe a producer decision or maybe just something that they felt that they couldn't not do. But, you know, it does take something away from the movie overall for me. I still really like it.
I agree, especially with him sleeping with the two girls at the Eagle's Nest.
Yeah.
If they had just like tempted him with it,
Yeah.
I think that would have been much more meaningful, especially since the through line of the movie is supposed to be that Bond is falling in love with Tracy. And if they had given him this smorgasbord of women to choose from in this place, which in any other situation Bond would be all about, right? He'd be flirting with everybody and, you know, being all suave and debonair. If they had shown him that, you know, option and then had him still choose to be faithful to Tracy, I think that would have been better. And for me, it does take away from the movie. Like, it takes away from what the movie could have been for me. It could have been that much better.
Yeah. I think it's a case of, like, multiple things can be true at once, right?
Yeah.
Like, there are definitely the problematic elements, which we talked about all through this episode, I think. But I do think that despite that, it is still one of the best Bond movies. I guess I don't really have anything else to say other than that. I just think that we can acknowledge the parts that are kind of sucky while also acknowledging that even in spite of that, like, this is still one of the best movies. And you're right, Jeff, maybe if some of those elements weren't there, maybe it would be the best, you know, in the series.
Which is kind of what our last question here is where does it stand within the series in terms of its importance, and do we consider it one of the best entries? I think we all kind of agree, and we've kind of set throughout here, that we do think it's one of the best entries in the franchise. And it really is unfortunate, in my opinion, that the franchise took the turn it did after this movie. Obviously, I like where it has come back around to, but you know, I feel like
if this movie was more financially successful, it could have made the franchise better going forward. But I definitely think it's an anticipation of my favorite ones that would come later, and I think, especially given it was made in 1969, this is a really impressive film to have in this series. And yeah, it's still, like, it's top 5 for me. So.
Yep.
Well, so now we are into the part of the show where we rank our film to remember against all the other films we've remembered. So
I remember all of them
because Josh isn't here.
And Josh also did not give us his rating ahead of time, so I'm sure he will just, correct us next week on how wrong we are in this episode.
But do we give Matt powers, and Josh is just going to have to deal with it?
I think we're going to hear what Matt's opinion is on where he would put it in our list.
Right.
But you and I are just going to average where we're at for now, and if we need to correct that next week, we'll move it next week.
I'm a non-voting member of the board here. I only get, like, the common stock shares. I don't get those,
we grant
fancy
you a seat on the council,
stock.
but we do not give you the rank of master.
Oh man, I better go murder some younglings now.
It's preposterous.
Our current top 10 is The Thing at number 10, Mulholland Drive at number 9, Lawrence of Arabia at number 8, The Departed at number 7, Boogie Nights at number 6, Shaun of the Dead at number 5, Paddington 2 at number 4, The Silence of the Lambs at number 3, Doctor Strangelove number 2, and Ferris Bueller's Day Off, still number 1 with a bullet.
Yep.
So, what do you think here? We'll start with Hugo. Hugo, where would you put it?
I think I would put it more or less exactly where I ranked the last movie we did. So I think I would put it at around number 21. So, no, wait, 22, just below Ansandi, above Rudy, below Jackie Brown, Ansandi, above Rudy, above 127.
So we kind of take approaches here where we look for the movie that we feel is most egregiously overranked personally, and then we
pretty much how it happens.
Where do we put it in relation to that movie? So
yeah, you gotta have
Hugo goes to Rudy. He goes to Rudy every time. He's like, okay, I like it better than Rudy. It goes above Rudy.
Yep.
So Hugo says On Her Majesty's Secret Service would be at 22.
Yep.
Matt, where would you put it?
Honestly, that's kind of how I had to look at these too. There are a lot of movies on this list that unfortunately I have not watched. I have not been a faithful listener of the podcast in a sense and watched along with you guys.
Kick him out of the call. Just
So,
Get out, get out.
I'm sorry. But yeah, no, as far as the ones that I have seen, I took the same approach that you just described for Hugo, which therefore would have me putting it at number 18 under Network and ahead of, well, I haven't seen Sound of Metal or a few of the others. Rudy is the next one I've seen. So ahead of Rudy, behind Network.
And Matt, of course, thinks Network is criminally underranked on our ranking system.
Criminally is a strong word, but yes.
fair enough.
I would put this. I go to the one that I think there's a line in our list that I'm like, okay, everything below this, it can be it's definitely better than this. And that line for me was Matrix Reloaded at 29. I do think it's better than the Matrix Reloaded, so that means I put it at
better than the Matrix Reloaded.
29.
Just put it out there.
Just behind the Trial of the Chicago 7.
I was going to say, you just stabbed Hugo in the gut there.
Yep.
That's
Hugo's
what
got a
happens
lot
every
of
week.
stab wounds after.
To be honest, like this podcast might as well be called "The Matrix Reloaded Sucks," and I'm one of the 5 people in the world who loves The Matrix Reloaded.
What's funny is when we did our episode on the Matrix, like Josh and I both like Matrix Reloaded.
That's true.
We just don't think it's fantastic.
But I love it. But I love that
Hugo
movie.
loves
it. Yeah. It is what it is. So our average would be between 22 and 29, correct?
Yes.
So before we know what Josh thinks, right now it would go at number 25. So above Chef and below Batman Mask of the Phantasm.
So that's where we're going to put that for now. Is on Her Majesty's Secret Service, number 25.
Yes.
We don't know what we're watching next week, unfortunately.
No.
So
Josh is enjoying a cool vacation. So
correct.
We
we fully support that, and I don't think anyone else is going to hold that against him. So what
Nope.
I would suggest
next week is a surprise movie, maybe, or we can come up with something together.
Well, and what I would suggest for those of you who are listening and watching, go ahead and follow at RTF_pod on Twitter, where we can announce what the next movie will be, and then you can watch it and join us for the next episode. Hugo, where can people find you on the internet?
You can find me at Hugo_Pinay on Twitter, and you can find my profile Hugo Pinay on letterboxd.
And our guest, wonderful guest. Thank you again, Matt, for coming on the show. Obviously, we've picked a couple of times for you to come on that you are really passionate about Bond and you're really passionate about David Lean. So, good fit. Again, I appreciate you coming on. Where can people find you on the internet?
Yeah, next time you'll have to have me on for something I really don't give a crap about, and we'll see how good of a host I am at that point. Really bad.
That sounds cool.
Twitter would be at Matthew E. Curran, and letterboxd is M.E. Curran. Like me, Curran.
And I'm on Twitter at GoodGameGrizz, and on Twitch at GoodGameGrizz, and on Letterboxd at GoodGameGrizz. So got that marketing on point.
Yeah.
So join us again next week for whatever we're going to talk about. It's been an absolute blast doing this show with you guys here today, and we hope you guys enjoyed it. If you're listening or watching, please follow and subscribe, and share our videos and podcasts with your friends and family who also like movies, because we'd love to get more people in the comments and sharing their thoughts on all our crazy lists. So
try to make
until
it so
next
it's
time.
not just me in the comments on the YouTube videos.
Hey, that's not fair. TJ's in there sometimes, and Christian
That's right.
jumps in every once in a while. Shout out to those guys. But again, thanks for watching and listening, and just have the best week of your life. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye.
Bye.